look at day 3. And I've got an outline on your outline sheet. It's not any different than what I have on the screen here. You can divide it into 2 parts. Verses 9 and 10, we have the creation of dry land and the seas. And then the second part, the creation of vegetation, verses 11 through 13. And then each of these will subdivide the parts as I've laid out on your outline sheet. First, we have characteristically, as we've had on the first 2 days, and as we'll see in the other days as well, the revelation, or and God said. God speaks, God reveals, God communicates. We have God initiating language and tying his thoughts to the material realm or to creation. So it's not unusual when you study nature that you see evidence of an intelligent designer, because he's built that into it. He's built thought, he's built ideas, he's built, or he put information in the creative realm. So we see that from the revelation. So verse 9, then God said. And this is stressed, not just for linguistic effect, but it's stressed because I think this is a very key and important element of God's creating. So it goes over and over. We've seen it already 2 times, and we'll see it again. Secondly, we have the articulation of that revelation. In other words, what God actually said. Verse 9, let the waters below the heavens. Remember on day 2 we had the separation, so it alludes to day 2. Notice the continuity. Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place. So we have the gathering of the waters. Remember, there was just the mass of water that's described not only before day 1, but the waters that are described on day 2. Now these waters, now if you just imagine this, just think of the planet and all of the water that is contained on our planet. I don't know the number of gallons, but it's got several digits, several, I don't even want to say the number because I'll be inaccurate, but many, probably trillions of gallons of water on planet Earth. Imagine God gathering all of that into one place, as it says there. So he gathered into one place and let the dry land appear. Now, notice there's an interesting word there. The word appear in the Hebrew text is related to the same word to see. In fact, it's very common in the Hebrew language. The idea is to see. In the Kal stem, it is usually translated to see something. God seeing. In fact, we have it in the context here. God saw his creation, and he saw that it was very good, or he sees it and he names it. We see it in this context. It's the same word. Now, I'm calling attention to this because in day 4, many of those that accommodate the text say that the sun and the moon and the stars were created earlier, but now they simply appear on day 4. This word doesn't occur on day 4. It's a different word, and when we get there, I will bring that out. So just kind of a heads up there. But here, the idea of something appearing, this is in the Nephil stem of the Hebrew. It carries the idea of something appearing, and it can be translated in that way in other passages. So in verse 9, we have the gathering of the waters in one place, or the calling, or the fiat of God, and let the dry land appear. So we have this separation. We've already seen 2 separations. A separation of light from darkness, day 1. Separation of the waters from the waters below and the waters above. And now when God gives form, he's separating the waters from the land. And we have that in verse 9. And then we have the accomplishment of that, and I'm going to draw attention to that. And it was so. A little phrase, not only in the English, but in the Hebrew. And it was so. But it is repeated after God's creative acts elsewhere, day 1, and some of the others later on, we'll see it was so. In fact, it reoccurs very frequently in the Genesis account. It's not just for linguistic effect. I think, again, it is emphasizing something, and I'll bring that out in a moment. It was so. It was fulfilled. It was immediate. In fact, that would be the main point that I'll draw. And then we have the accomplishment of it in beginning not only in verse 9, but it continues in verse 10. Before we get to verse 10, God called the dry land earth. After the accomplishment of it, we'll get to that in a moment. But verse 9, the word mayim that is here, referring to the waters in verse 9. And let's see, the gathering of the waters into one place. And he called the waters also in verse 10, is a general Hebrew term that can refer to any body of water. In fact, it's very common also, if you study the usages of it. We've already seen the reference to the waters of the deep in verse 2, same word. So it can refer to the depths of the ocean. I think that's, well, it's hard to say it in that way because this is before the ocean, but the depths of the water in the initial stage of God's creative acts that are described in verse 2. The depths, in other places, it refers to the depths of the sea, but it can refer to a spring, or it can refer to a well of water, or a river of water, or a sea of water. The word occurs very frequently in association with the waters of the flood and other floods elsewhere. It can refer to subterranean waters. It can refer to waters in the cloud. There's passages that this word is used in all of these senses. It can refer to the rain. So it's a general overall term. It could even refer to dew. But here it refers specifically to God separating the land from these large bodies of water we call the seas. So that's a term, and by the way, some of this is on the back of your outline sheet, the terms, the major terms here. Verse 10 moves to the naming of portions of God's creative work here. And God called the dry land earth. Now it's interesting that the word that is used there, dry land, the emphasis is on the dry aspect. In fact, literally it means the dry. And to make sense, we add in the English the dry land in the context, that's what it refers to. But it refers to something dry. Now, the critics and those that argue for a long period of development here, or the old earth viewpoint, say that it's impossible for all of these things to take place on day 3. That the water would appear and then it would dry, and that it would require time for plants to appear, suggests long periods of time. Well, what is overlooked in that is that the miraculous power of God. And I think the stress of the text here is that when he creates it, instantaneously it is dry. The dry land, that's the emphasis. In fact, the word there for dry is used in terms of the children of Israel when they were experiencing the exodus from Egypt. And I think there's a stress in that passage as well. And it may be even an intentional allusion to day 3 here, or at least a hint of it by Moses. Moses wrote Exodus as well. But when they crossed the Red Sea, do you remember what did they walk on? Dry land. Same word that we have here in Genesis. So in Exodus 14:16, it says, God is promising here, as for you, lift up your staff and to Moses and stretch out your hand over the sea, divide it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. Same word that we have in Genesis 1:10. And then in verse 22, Exodus 14:22, and the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land. So if God could miraculously not only divide the Red Sea, but it was not a muddy ground, he instantaneously also dried it up. A miraculous act. Obviously, we would consider the dividing of the waters miraculous, and so also the dry land. So it's not out of the realm of God's omnipotence to be able to create instantaneously dry land. The argument of the critic omits the idea of the supernatural, omits the idea of the miraculous work of God. I think that's a stress in Genesis chapter 1. It's stressed again in verse 29, but the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea. And then it goes on and describes other things. Again in chapter 15, similarly, dry land. And if that weren't enough, in Nehemiah, this is all referring to the Exodus. Nehemiah refers back, and when he refers back, he makes the point that the children of Israel walked through on dry land. So we have to remember that what we have in Genesis 1 is God miraculously bringing about his creation. And that's the stress of the text. That's the intent of the Mosaic author. And to leave that out, to diminish it, and to emphasize anything naturalistic in Genesis chapter 1, I think is misrepresenting the intent of the text itself. And that's exactly what, obviously, the evolutionary theory and those that accept any aspects of evolution, like theistic evolutionists, or even those that try to accommodate the Bible by stretching out the time frame, progressive creationists, etc. So that's, I think, the emphasis of the text. So we have the naming motif here. In verse 10, God called the dry land earth. Now, this is another common word, eretz, sometimes translated land, sometimes translated the earth. Sometimes it's used, not real frequently, but it's used in a cosmological sense. Here, I think it pertains to a portion of the earth, that portion that we would describe as continents. But sometimes it's used of the earth as a planet. And actually, in verse 15, we'll look at that next week, let them be for lights in the expanse of the heaven to give light on the earth, viewing it as a planet. And then also in verse 17, referring to the earth there in Genesis chapter 1. And there's some other passages that refer to the earth as a planet. But in general, it refers to sometimes just land, like property, or sometimes it's used very commonly, land in a territorial sense, the land of Canaan. That's a real common usage. The land of Egypt, or the land of Israel. Or I've got a whole list of 60 that I found in Scripture. The land of Ethiopia, the land of Ur, the land of Gerar, the land of the Negev, etc. Just a lot of usages in the text. So it's a very common word. In fact, it occurs about 2,500 times and very frequent even in the book of Genesis. But the land, or this dry land, is called eretz, called earth. So it's descriptive of continents.